Revolutions are supposed to change everything. They begin with fire, with chants, with fists in the air, a new dawn, a new system, a new Africa. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Almost every African revolution has failed. They start as revolutions and end as coups, dictatorships, or just chaos. Today, we're asking the hard questions. Why? Why does Africa seem trapped in this endless cycle where hope rises only to be crushed under the same old systems with a new face? First things first, we need to clear this up. A coup is not a revolution. A coup just swaps out the leaders, but the system stays the same, whereby a revolution changes the system itself. A coup d'etat can be described as a sudden, often violent, illegal takeover of its state, usually led by the military or a small elite group. Always led by generals, politicians, or insiders with the goal to replace the leadership but keep the same state structure. A few examples is the Egyptian military ousting President Morsi in 2013 and Captain Ibrahim Traore removing President Damiba in September 2022. Whereas a revolution is seen more as a mass uprising aimed at a fundamental change in political, social, or economic systems, led by a broad participation consisting of ordinary people, workers, peasants, and activists, with a goal to transform the entire system, not just the leader. An example of a revolution is the Iranian Revolution that took place in 1979 and the 2011 Arab Spring that began in Tunisia. But in Africa, these lines blur. Leaders come in with revolutionary slogans, but quickly the movements are hijacked by militaries or political elites. Think of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. He called for self-reliance, women's liberation, and Pan-African unity. But 4 years later, he was assassinated by his own comrade, Blaise Compaoré, in a coup. The revolution reduced the power of politics. And that's the first reason revolutions fail. The system doesn't change, just the actors. So, what rarely gets acknowledged is that revolutions need national unity. They're national building projects. But African states were never designed for unity. Let's go back to 1884 at the Berlin Conference. A handful of European powers gathered in a cold German winter with maps and rulers on polished tables carved Africa into more than 50 artificial states. No African voices were in the room. Borders were drawn like straight lines on paper, slicing through kingdoms, villages, and trade routes that had existed for centuries. Entire ethnic groups were split apart, while rivals were forced inside the same fragile state. What was created wasn't unity, it was a patchwork of fault lines waiting to fracture. So when revolutions happen, they don't erupt in cohesive nations, they erupt in fragile, divided ones. Look at South Sudan. It fought for decades to free itself from Sudan. Independence came in 2011, a revolution was fulfilled. But 2 years later, a civil war tore the country apart along ethnic lines. Revolutions keep burning out because the foundation was rigged from the start. Okay, picture this with me for a second. The revolution is over, we've marched, we've fought, we've bled, and now we've won. The colonizers are gone, the flag is ours, and the people are looking at us to deliver the promises we made. Schools, jobs, roads, a future. But here's the catch. What we inherited isn't a nation, it's a machine, and it was never built to serve us. Most of the systems that were left behind, governments, economies, even the roads beneath our feet, were designed for one thing: extraction, not self-sufficiency. Look at the infrastructure. Railways don't link African cities together. That became a huge barrier to scaling up local trade, international or continental trade. They run from copper mines in Zambia, cacao farms in Ghana, straight to the ports. Roads cut across the land, but their only purpose was to move raw materials to the coast. These structures were designed to move raw materials from mines and plantations to the coast for export. Even today, it's cheaper to ship goods from Lagos to London than Lagos to Kinshasa. Air travel, the same story. It's dominated by Europe. Sometimes it's faster to fly from Dakar to Paris and then down to Nairobi than to fly directly within the continent itself. After independence, many states inherit these extractive systems. And the thing is, aids and loans are put in place to reinforce these structures instead of restructuring them. And that's why infrastructure matters, because without roads that connect us, railways that unite regions, or communication systems that let markets talk to each other, trade collapses before it even begins. Independent leaders inherit these skeletons and extractive systems designed to serve Europe, not Africa. And every attempt to rebuild on top of it meant taking loans, aid, or patchwork fixes that often reinforce the same colonial patterns. Many African nations aren't just cut off by weak infrastructure, but they are also geographically isolated. Landlocked countries like Chad, Niger, or Zambia don't have direct access to the sea, which means every shipment of goods must cross through multiple borders before it reaches a port. That geography locks them out of global trade networks, making it easier to export raw materials from Africa to Europe than for some African neighbors to trade with each other. So yes, we may have won the revolution, but how do you build a nation when the very foundations were designed to keep you dependent? That's why after revolutions, countries fall back into dependence on foreign markets, and dependency makes revolutions fragile. Even the most radical revolutions face the same wall: money. Around the 1970s, going towards the 1980s, revolutionary or post-independence governments in Africa started facing debt crises caused mainly by declining commodity prices, oil shocks, and heavy borrowing. Many had to turn to the International Monetary Fund, also known as the IMF, and the World Bank for financial support. But these institutions did not just hand out loans. The loans came with conditions: privatization, subsidy cuts, and liberalization. These were known as structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, were sets of economic reforms imposed as conditions for loan or debt relief. The idea was to liberalize African economies, making them more open to global markets and less state-controlled. What they don't tell you is that public services get gutted, education systems get weakened, healthcare left underfunded, and food subsidies get removed, leaving ordinary people to carry the cost of independence. The structural adjustments typically include currency devaluation, where local currencies are deliberately devalued to make exports cheaper and imports more expensive. The second is market-oriented agriculture. Subsistence farmers were encouraged or outright forced to grow cash crops for export: coffee, cacao, cotton, rather than food for local consumption. This made these communities dependent on global commodity prices and leaves them to be more vulnerable to famine. The third being privatization of state enterprises. State-owned industries such as railways, utilities, banks, etc. get sold off, often to foreign investors. Instead of creating efficiency, it leads to job loss and weakens self-governance over key sectors. The fourth being trade liberalization. The removal of tariffs and trade protection lead the local industry and farmers being exposed to competition from global markets. Many African industries collapse almost overnight under this pressure. And the fifth one, which I feel like is the most common cause of failed revolutions, is the cutting down of public spending, known as austerity. This is where governments slash budgets for education, healthcare, and subsidies on food or fuel. This only worsens the poverty. This hits the population immediately, unlike trade or privatization, which may take months or years to show the full impact. Revolutionary governments that promised dignity suddenly look like managers of austerity. They lose legitimacy. Anger over rising poverty, hunger, and collapsing schools or hospitals quickly turn into mass protests. Militaries or opposition movements exploit this discontent, justifying a coup or sparking another revolt with the promises of restoring dignity. In many countries such as Zambia, Ghana, and Nigeria, SAPs deepened inequality, worsened poverty, and sparked protests that further destabilized governments. The truth is, revolutions are being strangled by external control. Leaders who shout about sovereignty still end up being limited by global financial institutions even after independence. In short, SAPs act as a form of economic neocolonialism. Here's the dirty truth. During the Cold War, African revolutions weren't just African. They were just pawns in a global chess game. During the Cold War, neither Washington nor Moscow cared about African industrial development. What they wanted were their minerals: copper, cobalt, uranium, the fuel for their global standoff. Stability wasn't in their interest because a stable Africa could demand fair prices, so instead they backed regimes and rebels alike as long as the resources kept flowing cheaply to feed their war machines. I mean, if you look closely, Africa did fund the Cold War. Think about it. Uranium came from the Shinkolobwe mine in the Belgian Congo, which powered the Manhattan Project and gave the US its first nuclear bomb. Cobalt, copper, gold, and oil, all ripped from African soil, were funneled straight to the military industry machines of both Washington and Moscow. Even apartheid South Africa became one of the world's most major uranium suppliers, feeding the very standoff that kept the world on edge for decades. So when we talk about the Cold War, we have to admit it wasn't just fought in Berlin or Havana. It was bankrolled by African land and African labor. In the central Congo, also known as Zaire, Mobutu got US backing, but not only because he was anti-communist. It was also geography. Zaire sat at the heart of Africa, a key domino in the Cold War. If Congo tilted towards communism, the fear was that all of Southern Africa might follow. That's why the CIA supported Mobutu's coup in 1965 and kept him in power for 30 years, despite extreme corruption. He was quite simply their man in Africa. On the other hand, Mengistu in Ethiopia got Soviet backing. Ethiopia sits on the Horn of Africa, right by the Red Sea and the routes to the Middle Eastern oil, a vital choke point in the Cold War. For Moscow, Ethiopia became proof that Marxism could take root in Africa, and they poured in weapons, advisors, and support to keep Mengistu in power. Liberation was the promise, dictatorship was the reality, and independence, it was sacrificed for someone else's war. Revolutions promise to use resources for the people, but natural wealth often becomes the weapon that kills the revolution. This is known as the resource curse. The resource curse, also known as the paradox of plenty, is where countries with abundant resources like oil or minerals often experience slower economic growth, less democracy, and worse development outcomes than resource-poor countries. Through this research, we found a study in the East Asian Economic Review called Natural Resources Governance and Economic Growth in Africa. And it points out something interesting. The paper suggests that it's not the resources themselves, but who controls them and how weak institutions deepen the failures of revolutions. Resources don't doom a country automatically. The real problem is governance. In Africa, resource wealth becomes dangerous because it collides with weak institutions, fragile states, and undemocratic systems. Oil, diamonds, cobalt, they don't just create wealth, they create incentives for corruption, coups, and foreign meddling. And here's the critical point. The curse isn't in the resource itself, it's in how it interacts with instability. When governments lack accountability, when militaries see resources as a ticket to power, when the elite capture all the profits, then the so-called resource curse takes root. That's why in Africa, the impact of governance is more decisive than in Europe or Asia. The resource wealth doesn't just sit there, it amplifies instability, fuels oppressiveness, and turns revolutions into new cycles of exploitation. But maybe it's not a curse at all, maybe it's a system. One where global markets reward raw exports and punish self-reliance. Either way, resources that should fuel revolutions end up fueling their collapse. So, this got me thinking. Africa wasn't alone in the struggle. Across the world, other continents were also fighting for independence, sliding into dictatorships and wrestling with the same big question of survival. And one case stands out: Asia. Take South Korea in the 1960s. At the same time Ghana was newly independent and dirt poor, Korea was just as poor, just as unstable, and under a military dictatorship too. Two countries, two continents, both starting from the same point. But their stories end very differently. One succeeded in building industry, education, and exports, while the other was trapped in coups, debt, and stagnation. Why? Well, because Korea was treated as a frontline ally in the Cold War. See, South Korea's rise wasn't just about hard work and planning, it was also about geopolitics. During the Cold War, Korea sat on the front lines between communism and capitalism, right next to China and the Soviet Union. For the US, keeping Korea alive and strong was non-negotiable. That meant billions in aid, open access to US markets, military protection, and pressure on Korean dictators to prioritize industrialization. Korea wasn't just left to sink or swim on its own. It was treated as an ally because losing it to communism would have been a massive blow in the Cold War chessboard. Africa, on the other hand, didn't. Africa was seen as a resource depot, not as a partner. Because after independence, both parts of Asia and countries like Ghana took the same steps. They went to the IMF, they borrowed from the World Bank, and they accepted US aid. On paper, their paths looked similar, but over time, the outcomes could not have been more different. One of the key differences lies in how global systems treated African countries. The structural adjustments. The adjustments forced harsh cuts on privatization and austerity. These hit Africa much earlier and much harder. In Korea, those same policies only came later after the country had already built a strong industrial base. Another factor is access. Korea and Taiwan were given preferential entry into US markets. They could export textiles, electronics, even steel with relatively few restrictions. That export access was everything. It created what economists call export discipline, forcing industries to compete globally and get better. Africa didn't get that. Instead, African textiles and farm products ran into tariffs, quotas, and protectionism. The only thing the West welcomed without restrictions were raw materials, not finished African goods. A final point worth stressing is that just like Korea and Taiwan, the US had no interest in seeing the Congo or South Africa fall into communism. That's why Mobutu in Zaire was propped up for decades despite his corruption, and that's why apartheid South Africa stayed a US ally even under global condemnation. On the surface, you'd think that strategic importance should have earned them the same benefits, right? I mean, it only makes sense. But it didn't. Korea and Taiwan were showcases, proof that capitalism could thrive on communism's doorstep, where the Congo and South Africa were never treated that way. To Washington, they weren't models to be built up, they were mines to be tapped. As long as the uranium, cobalt, and gold kept flowing cheaply, America was satisfied. In the end, revolutions can't survive on ideals alone. They need global backing, and Africa never got it. Today, we're seeing a new wave. of revolutions. In the Sahel, young leaders rejecting Western influence, talking about unity, self-reliance, and dignity. But here's the fear: will these revolutions follow the same pattern? Will they be crushed by debt, sabotaged by foreign powers, or hijacked by militaries? History suggests they might, because without breaking the structural traps, borders, infrastructure, debt, and dependency, revolutions remain fragile sparks quickly extinguished. So, why do African revolutions always fail? Well, because they're not just fighting corrupt leaders, they are fighting broken states, hostile borders, predatory global systems, and resource traps. Revolutions promise new beginnings, but until the foundations change, infrastructure, trade, governance, and unity, revolutions will keep collapsing into coups, dictatorships, or endless cycles of disappointments. And maybe that's the harsh truth. Africa doesn't just need revolutions, it needs reconstruction. So tell us what you think. Do you think Africa's new wave of revolutions can finally break the cycle, or are we doomed to repeat history? Let us know in the comments what you think. This is the Need to Know channel, and thank you.